Hi, and welcome to another episode of MusicXperience podcast. Today, we travel through Brilliant Mind of Tobias Sammet. Despite the fact that I don't usually revisit albums I've listened to once, other than refreshing them on rotation in favorites, yet Avantasia is such an important band to me that I thought it deserved a few words of review. The band, founded by Tobias Sammet in 1999, is a metal opera conglomerate of the best power and heavy metal performers. And despite the fact that the concept has changed over the years, more on that later, yet the backyard of symphonic power metal they deservedly occupy a very high place. Over the years, Tobias has invited such tourmates as Michael Kiske of Gamma Ray, Halloween, Bob Catley of Magnum and Klaus Meine of the Scorpions on his albums. Any such work could be considered a test of vocal ability for the performer in question, as they usually deviated in form from the standard performances of their parent groups. Tobias began his career in Netguy, which is still active despite an 11 years hiatus in publishing. However, honing his form there, he took on songs with less epic and anthemic content. Edguy, however, provided an excellent bridge for the development of his vocals. Here Be Dragons is the 10th release from under the Avantasia banner. At this point, it is worth looking at the band's past. The biggest work of this collective is considered, not without reason, the first two releases, the two parts of metal opera. First of all, these are the albums that are milestones in defining the foundations of the genre in its basic tenets. Reach Out for the Light or Farewell are to this day the band's best rated songs, and their sound still manages to stand up after 14 years. However, it's worth taking into account that these were Tobias' solo releases and were only a foretaste of what would actually be the group's main asset in the following years, namely guest appearances. The following years brought first of all Scarecrow, a perfect album, where each guest artist took his song to the absolute heights of his abilities. Each song stanza hit the spot, and the songs there stayed with me for years. Similarly, Angel of Babylon, which unfortunately was not without its wicked presages, but made up for greatly through this atmosphere, dark and depressing, so different from the more positive overtones of its predecessor. Unfortunately, the next two releases seem to lose the magic that the formula carried. The guest did not come as a surprise. In fact, one could even say that Tobias began to chase a bit of a heel with the selection of actors of his performances, with commendable exceptions, such as aforementioned Klaus Meine in the song Dying for an Angel. However, 2019 and Moonglow have arrived, and this album can be defined by one title, The Raven Child. I haven't heard such an epic ballad since Angel of Babylon. Equally enjoyable is The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, however, mainly due to the variety and consonance of so many different vocalists within one song. And so we come to the precursor of the hero of this review, A Paranormal Evening with the Moonflower Society, and it is, for me personally, a ghost album. I rated it very highly, as it has received a 4.09 per 5 from me, so it came close to perfect. However, if you asked me what songs were most memorable to me, I wouldn't be able to point them out. I have a similar problem with Alex Rudipel's album. It's just that a certain constant high level causes subsequent releases, despite really good content, to lack breakpoints and merge into one string of hits. However, this problem is not the case with Here Be Dragons. First of all, Tobias chose Creepshow as the premiere single from this album. This is a track that is absolutely different from the standard, directing the listener deep into the past to Edguy's most classic achievements such as Lavatory Love Machine. Taking into account Return to Opera, which by the way deserves a separate paragraph on its own, it can be assumed that such a choice of representative was influenced by the reception of previous releases and increasingly strong requests to return to the roots and record another metal opera. However, this is only a temporary deception. Already in the title track, the classic energetic, pompous guitars with Tobias and Geoff's powerful vocal returns. The Moorlands at Twilight is definitely the scarecrow of this release. This is how I define the aforementioned points with the greatest potential for memorability. The beautiful rhythm of the drums being the focal point of the composition, Michael Kiske sound like in the golden days of Halloween, perfection. Similarly, the final "Everybody's Here Until the End" can be described as a coda from The Real Thing, where the chorus really hits the listener with a powerful impact. The which, with new guest Tommy Karevik of Camelot, takes a turn into a slightly gothic tones, familiar from Tommy Parent's band, through which the track approaches areas close to the recently reviewed Nightwish. Especially check out the passage before the final chorus. Phantasmagoria, with practically constant member Ronnie Atkins, is a classic Edguy or Halloween-style gallop. Unfortunately, it's hard not to notice that Ronnie is already approaching the limits of his vocal abilities, and such a high tempo severely strains his vocal cords. It was nice to hear Bob Catley in a form taken straight out from On a Storyteller's Night, although Bring on the Night sounds like it was taken out of Magnum's catalogue rather than Avantasia's. As a kind of grand pause, it might work well. Therefore, this track was a thorn in my side when evaluating this release, and ultimately I have to rate it negatively. Unleash the Kraken, on the other hand, sounds like it was ripped from Primal Fear's catalogue and would have asked for another guest appearance from Ralph Shippers, if only as support in the chorus, which, is worth noting, is mixed in a terrible way. Tobias, you did it again, although I'll return to the technical aspects themselves. Next up is Avalon, which actually gives away all of its content with its name. An epic adventure with Dungeons and Dragons. Sound as if it taken alive from the annals of Rhapsody. Against of Wind, the author of one of the best heavy metal albums of 2K22, that is the Force Majeure, is a return to tracks more energetic and to the point, pure heavy metal in the stanzas watered down with the power metal sauce of the chorus. And the remaining gem, Return to the Opera. Opening the second disc is an absolute mockery of the haters and purists who, as I mentioned above, do not recognize any other Avantasia than the one from the first two albums, and the chorus itself says it all. Now it's the time you will get what you want. 7 angels reach out for the light. Now it's the time you will get what you want. Then, will you leave me alone, please? Of course, referring to the aforementioned ultra-classic compositions, it is one big middle finger to these accusations, but technically flawless, which could further strike those purists' nerves that are already tense as a post. Unfortunately, despite the fact that compositionally I have nothing to complain about, so from a technical point of view the album has much to complain about. First of all, the reference to the classics has its own rules, and it should apply only to the composition, not to the created sound of instruments. Tobias has flattened the drums terribly. Not for the first time I can describe them as banging on a bucket of magnet paint, because actually only this sound can be drawn from this part of the instrumentation. It's also worth noting that the strictly guitar sounds here are actually limited to pre-refrains and choruses, and most of the stanzas are based on keyboard sounds and single string sounds, or drum rhythm. There's no denying that this builds atmosphere and diversifies the reception of individual songs, but it's hard to pass by the statement that naturally comes to mind: there's a lack of claw here. After 10 albums, I can conclude that Avantasia is not slowing down and still manages to create a genre masterpiece. At the same time, this is an album that I would want to listen to at least once a day from cover to cover? Absolutely not. Although 90% of the tracks I would love to hear again, so in the whole album there are actually 3 moments where I could completely disconnect from the surrounding world. So, unfortunately, the level of its predecessor has been maintained. Thank you for today's episode, leave a like, subscribe, and see you next time.